right
I'm
now.
in Ireland, actually. Yeah, so yeah, I'm in Ireland. Yeah, I'm across the other bit of water.
Yeah. Wow, so we've got such 3 different countries. That's exciting.
Yeah, multinational.
Yeah, exactly. So how did you both first meet as well? Then, if you're 2 different places.
I know, it's amazing. Well, we met, we were just reminiscing actually. We met first at a Historical Novel Society conference in Oxford, gosh, three years ago. And amazingly, they have a fancy dress pageant on one of the evenings. And the first time I properly met Laura, she was dressed as a fabulous gondolier from Venice in the 17th century or something fantastic. And I think, did you win? Did you win that year?
I won, yes.
There you go.
Actually, I was a runner-up, but and it was hilarious because it really was the one and only time I've ever cross-dressed, and it worked
Amazing.
for me. So maybe I should do it again. I don't know.
It was fantastic.
It was really fun. It was, you know, the costumes. People come to the conference, you know, with this very serious minded and there to discuss, you know, these very big, serious topics of history. And then on the one night you have this costume contest, which is just so much fun. And to see the beautiful dresses and the funny things, and you know, you see characters from the ancient world to the 20th century, and it's fabulous.
Amazing. I love that. And Hazel, what were you dressed up as?
I was actually dressed as myself.
Oh.
I was slightly, it was the year that I had written The Girl from the Savoy. So I was in 2 minds as to whether to go as a flapper, and I chickened out at the last minute. So I wore my red dress and red shoes in homage to Dolly, my character in the novel, who wants to be a dancer on the West End stage. But it was, I think I made the right call because the costumes were so professional and mine would have been very homemade. So I just enjoyed watching everyone else. It was amazing. I think people sometimes think historical fiction authors are terribly serious, and that we sit around sipping brandies and, you know, ruminating on times past, and not at all. It's really good.
Yeah, like a wild party. That's amazing.
Fun.
Oh, great. Well, now that we're here and we're going, I'm going to get started with some of the questions that I've got for you both to discuss your wonderful new books. So we've got a few people watching. Please do comment away your questions as well. And yeah, hopefully Claire will be continuing to post, and more people, the people that were already on the other feed will rejoin us, but we'll get started. So my first question to you both is, without giving anything away, can you tell us a bit about the story of both The Night Portrait and The Bird in the Bamboo Cage? You know, to a bit spoiler free for anyone who hasn't yet had a chance to read your amazing books. Laura, would you like to go first?
Sure. Yeah. So this is The Night Portrait. And there's the cover.
Great, I love it. I love you there, ready to go.
The Night Portrait revolves around this painting, which is the famous Lady with the Urman by Leonardo da Vinci. And if you Google it, then you'll see it in its beautiful, colorful glory. So it's a story in 2 timelines. It goes back and forth between the 1490s and the 1940s. What ties these 2 very different time periods together is this one portrait by Leonardo da Vinci. And so what fascinated me about this portrait is that Cecilia Gallerani, who is the lovely young woman in the portrait, was an object of desire and obsession of 2 very ruthless, powerful men 500 years apart. And so even though the 2 timelines are very different, the story of this portrait in these 2 eras has some really amazing crossovers. And so I hope that some of you have read it, or that intrigued you enough to want to take a look at it.
Definitely, I love that as a premise, or I love as of the story. It's so intriguing, exciting. So Hazel, can you tell us about the bit about story of the bird in the bamboo cage?
Yeah, and I just have to say that sounds so fascinating. And I know that portrait, and I've always thought it was a stunning portrait. So I can't wait to find out who she was and the story around it. That's such an amazing premise. The Bird in the Bamboo Cage is set in World War II, which has been an incredibly popular space for historical fiction in recent years. But my book is set in China, which I don't think we have read about or, sort of heard as much about that part of the war. And it's inspired by an incredible true story I discovered about 3 years ago now, which revolves around a group of school children and their teachers. The school that this is based on was called Chifu School in northeastern China. And the school was essentially a boarding school for the sons and daughters of diplomats, missionaries, businessmen working and living in the area at the time. A very elite school for Americans, European, Western children, essentially. And after the events of Pearl Harbor, everybody's life literally changed overnight. The school was occupied by the Japanese army, and within a year, the entire school of around 100 children and their teachers were taken to an internment camp in northern China called Weishen, where they spent the remaining years of the war. And when I first heard this story, it was one of those goosebump moments. I couldn't sort of correlate the children and teachers and an internment camp. And in this part of war, we don't hear as much about. So I tell the story through two fictional characters, Nancy, a 10-year-old girl, and her teacher, Miss Kent, Elspeth. So we see how this experience unravels from very, very different points of view as we follow them through the years of the war. So just an remarkable part of the war and just an incredible piece of history to have researched and written. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds so fascinating, and that's with both of you. They're both essentially based on true stories, as well as how. So did you both just go discover both of these stories? And that's, I mean, Hazel, you kind of touched on that just then, but Laura, was that the same with you? You wanted to, uncover more about this, the painting, this girl, and everything else.
Yeah, so this story came to me kind of over a long period of time because I am an art historian by training. I taught art history at the college level, and I had known about this painting of the lady with the ermine for many years and knew its Renaissance history, knew its history in the 15th and 16th centuries. But as Hazel pointed out, there's a lot of interest in World War II right now, but it was an era that I really never thought that I would write in. It was, whenever I've read about World War II or watched documentaries, it's been an era for me that has been so deeply disturbing. Just the inhumanity, the scale of it has, left me feeling like I wanted to lose faith in humanity. But what's interesting is it's thanks to my son, who's now 21, who himself is very fascinated with history. And as a little kid, he knew all the planes and the tanks and the trains and the players of World War II. He was really fascinated with it. And he pulled me onto the couch one evening and said, watch this documentary with me. And it was a World War II documentary. And I was like, oh no, I don't think I want to see it. But part of the story was about the lady with the ermine and how it had hung on the wall of this Bavarian lakeside villa that belonged to Hans Frank, who was this high-ranking Nazi leader. He was Hitler's appointed governor of occupied Poland. And I thought, how is that possible that this famous portrait ended up on this man's wall in his home in Bavaria during World War II? So I just was curious about that, and I started going down these research rabbit holes, as we do as historical novelists. And it was so fascinating to me to find that the 20th century story had so many correlations to the 15th century story that suddenly this tale told in two timelines kind of emerged. But yes, I mean, I think that there's so many true stories that, you know, where the truth is stranger than fiction, things that you just can't make up, that is fascinating. And I love, Hazel, that you found this tale in this far-flung, you know, part of the world that sometimes maybe is not the first thing that comes to mind when we think of a World War II setting. But I think that what historical novelists are finding right now is that there's so many of these individual stories of this during this war era. I mean, people in different places had completely different experiences of the war. And so I love that you, Hazel, were able to pull this thread of this one story out. And I think that's how how readers experience history through the eye of a historical novelist, is through these individual stories and threads.
I think that's a really good point that you make, actually, about, because I was the same. I hadn't written anything set in the Second World War. I'd written a novel in the First World War, but I, again, was quite horrified by the brutality of World War II. And obviously, we think a lot about the Holocaust, and it's a difficult place to go as a writer or as a reader. And I had therefore sort of discounted it as well. And I had an interest in the Second World War because of some amazing family letters I'd been given, which my great-grandmother wrote to her son, my great-uncle Jack, who sadly went missing in action. We believed he was in France. And her letters to him, desperately wishing to hear from him, to hear some news, were kept by my grandmother and eventually were passed on to me. And when I read her letters, it totally changed my view of the war. And I always thought it was a very masculine event. It was very much about battles and war. And actually, reading my great-grandmother's letters, I changed my mind completely, because she was just a mother desperately wanting to hear from her son. And as a mother myself, I could have some connection and empathy with that. And that's where my interest in the war as a very human event that happened to very, very ordinary people who suddenly overnight, very much as we find ourselves now in this global pandemic, our lives have changed unrecognizably, and as did people's in the war. And so connecting that to this remarkable story of children and their teachers, that really fascinated me, because it wasn't a military campaign. It wasn't the places in Europe that we've heard about. And to me, that opened up the event. And I hope I've written a book that shows the resilience of the human spirit. It's a book very much about friendship, about how we rely on each other in times of hardship, how we forge friendships that we wouldn't expect to forge. And that's what a lot of readers have said. And I think that's interesting, that war doesn't always have to be desperate and brutal. It can also show us the best of people, and teach us a lot about the human condition. And so, yeah, I'm really pleased that I sort of took a leap of faith and, stepped into this different part of history. And I'm now fascinated by it. And there are so many, as you said, Laura, so many individual experiences that we're just beginning to hear about, and so many stories to tell. And it's really important we do. Yeah,
absolutely. That's what I found. Both of your, you've kind of both been talking about it there, but both of your novels, they've both taken two, you think it's that sort of, you think a lot about World War II or things that have happened, and you kind of maybe don't necessarily want to go there again, but you've both uncovered these two incredible stories of just of true events and real people, and made it that bit more relatable, but also on that, as you were just saying then, Hazel, on a very true stories of resilience and empathy, which is was so valuable right now as ever. There was two beautiful stories, and I think that's both two amazing descriptions or deep dives into both your sort of inspirations and also why you chose those parts specifically of World War II history, which was one of my questions.
Well, there you go. We answered it for you. And I think it's fascinating that, you know, as you say, two beautiful stories. And I think, you know, art, you wouldn't necessarily put a classic piece of Renaissance art within a World War II setting. And I think this is why I really encourage people, if they haven't read historical fiction, to give it a try, because there are the most astonishing stories, and they're not at all, as I said, from that masculine point of view. And I think naturally as a woman, I'm really interested in the female experience of those events as well. And I think, you know, as Laura's done, you can bring art and beauty into that difficult world event. And it's endlessly fascinating, I think, what we can learn.
Definitely. So actually, I've got my next question for you, because we've been talking all about you know, so much research has obviously gone into both of your novels, which is absolutely incredible. But I was just wondering, how do you ultimately approach your research? And you know, this must be you must uncover so much. And how do you kind of funnel that all into what is an incredible story? Hazel or Laura, who would prefer to go first on this question?
Do you want to go, Laura, first?
Yeah, Laura, do you want to go first?
Sure, I'll go. So, you know, doing research in the Italian Renaissance and World War II obviously were two completely different exercises for me. Needless to say, there's a lot more that survives from World War II. They're very different kinds of documents. But whenever I start a project, I always start with primary sources, so things that were written at the time. I think that it's important on several levels. One is you hear the voices of the people from the time, and it helps you as a writer to get into the head of the people who were living at that time. Mm-hmm. So I always start with primary accounts, things that were written at the time. So for, you know, an Italian Renaissance painting, for example, I'm always looking for contracts between artists and patrons. I'm always looking for letters, things that people wrote about artists and about works of art at the time. So for the Italian Renaissance and for this painting, we have a very interesting primary source, which is a letter written by Leonardo da Vinci to Ludovico Sforza, who was the de facto Duke of Milan, and he was the man who commissioned this beautiful portrait of Cecilia, who was his 16-year-old pregnant mistress at the time. And in this letter, Leonardo sort of, it's almost like a resume. He proposes to Ludovico Sforza that he come from Florence to Milan, and that the Duke should employ him. And he gives a list of all of his qualifications. He sort of lists them out 1 through, I don't know, 13, 14 things. Yeah. And he starts by describing all of the military engineering projects that he could potentially do for the Duke. He talks about making collapsible bridges or explosives that could blow up a mine. He talks about flying machines. He talks about tanks, armored tanks. And so it's fascinating already because there's this parallel with some of the contraptions of World War II. Yeah. And at the very end of this letter, he says, oh, and in times of peace, I can make sculpture. And by the way, I can also paint just as well as anyone else, which is hilarious because he doesn't even say I can paint better than everyone else. He just says I can paint just as well as the next guy. And so, you know, it's fascinating already because we're in the head of Leonardo da Vinci and we see that he is not interested in painting seemingly at all, but he's interested in these war machines instead. And so it makes him a very interesting character, I think, to write about. So, you know, for World War II, obviously, there are lots of different sources, and there are some actual people who lived, historical people in the Night Portrait. I looked at things like the Nuremberg trials. I looked at the transcripts of the Nuremberg trials, which specifically mention this portrait. I looked at letters that were written, like you described, Hazel, between family members. I looked at things that art historians wrote at the time. And then certainly there's a lot of information as well about the monuments men, who were these this special allied force whose job it was to prevent damage to the Ponte Vecchio in Florence or the great cathedrals of Europe, as well as to confiscate and restitute these works of art at the end of the war. So there's just so much material for this book that it was really a fascinating project, and fun for me to find the links between the two timelines.
That must be hard to then funnel. I'm sure the same for you, Hazel, but you have so much that's so much. How do you then funnel it together into a story that we can all just really
that's what I was going to say. I think we hear about historical research, and you'd expect Laura's book should have been thousands and thousands and thousands of
right.
That's one of the skills, I think, of being a historical novelist is it's as much about what you leave out of your book as what you put in, because you will always over research, and you have to, in order to inform your understanding of that era, that event, those people. And it gives you the confidence then to inhabit your fictional world, because you understand where the people are, what they're eating, what they're wearing, how they travel. And that allows you to then just tell the story. But I think we all can totally nerd out at dinner parties with all the left out bits of research that never went into the book. And I think it's a sign of a really good historical novelist that the reader should really never be aware that they're reading research.
That's right.
If they are, we've dropped a clanger, because it should be a very light touch, and it should never distract from the characters and from the story. And I'm interested that Laura said she goes first to primary source, because I absolutely try to do the same. And I think it does give you that sense of authenticity, because you're hearing directly from, and of course when you're looking at an event like World War II, everything's propaganda. So if you can get to a diary, a letter, a person who's actually just privately written their thoughts, that's going to be more honest and real. And for me, that's always more interesting, because that's where we start to hear about the everyday. For example, when I was reading accounts of the teachers and children in Chifu school and then in the internment camp, it was about, what are we going to eat today? Gathering up leftover bits of coal dust to mash them together to make fuel for the fires for the winter. It was about the teachers grinding up leftover eggshells to make sure the children had calcium in their diet, because they were going through puberty, and they knew that if the children didn't get calcium, they would have severe problems in later life. And when you read those bits of detail, it stops becoming this remote, enormous global war, and it becomes a very relatable human event. And, I often say, regardless of where you set the book and what people looked like and how they traveled, etc., we still are concerned by the same things, aren't we? It's love, it's fear, it's greed, power, passion, and that's evergreen. And those are the things that often carry through every historical novel. So for me, it was the same. It was about primary sources at the archive of Chifu School, which fortunately for me is held at the University of London at the School of Oriental and African Studies. So a couple of years ago, when we could travel, I hopped over to London, and you get these incredibly old dusty archive boxes and have to hold them with gloves. And it's just such a privilege to step into that space. And then I found information online. The children as adults have written incredible personal accounts of their experience through childhood on a big website, which I think for them is quite cathartic. Some of them have come together to write a book. So you get this sort of layers of obviously understanding the war, the Sino-Japanese War, drilling down Pearl Harbor to frame everything, and then sort of what was really happening, and then you use your imagination to fill in some of the gaps in the archive as well. So it's an amazing part of, I think, writing historical fiction is It's hard, isn't it, Laura, to stop researching and start writing?
Oh, yeah. And I think, there's a couple of things there. I mean, you're totally right. And I think that historical novelists are constantly making decisions. We're just all throughout the entire thing, constantly making decisions about what needs to be included or incorporated somehow into the story and what doesn't. And but as Hazel mentioned, if the historical novelist has done her job or his job, all of that research should sort of be invisible. It should disappear, and you should just feel immersed in the story. So I went back to read Ken Follett's Pillars of the Earth. After 20 years, I went back and picked it up. Now, I specialized in medieval architecture as a student. I mean, I know those buildings inside and out. I know all the architectural terms for Gothic architecture and all of that, and more than anybody really else wants to know. But when I read that story of the construction of that great cathedral, none of that was in my head anymore. I just wanted to know what happened to this poor man who just got attacked on this ride on horse through the forest. I just care about the people in the story, and I want to know what's going to happen next. So, that's the mark of a great historical novelist. He made you feel like you were in that medieval building without knocking you over the head with a textbook, and you just care about what happens to the people. So
that's it. It's character, isn't it? It's the same with any book. And we tell our friends, and I know we're all great readers, and when you read a book and you love it, what do? You tell your friends, you gift it to people, and you say, oh, this is amazing. There's this young girl, it's the story of this particular piece of art and this man and this situation. We're not saying, did you know that in 1942, such and such? No, we don't remember that. It's just part of the world that we build for our readers. And, it's not easy to do all the time. But it's I think that's why we are drawn to write historical fiction, because I think your love of history has to come parallel with your love of story, and it's how you then, as you say, bend and shape all of that to make a compelling novel.
Absolutely. I think that's so incredible what you both do take these, huge events and these huge monumental stories, and then taking that to make it relatable, so then we can, really get to the heart of it is brilliant. And that is the mark of amazing historical fiction, isn't it?
Hopefully.
It is. It's amazing. We're getting some really nice questions here, so I'm going to bring a couple of these up. Don't know what's happening today. This Be Live thing doesn't really seem to, it's not loving me today, because usually, as anyone who's watched my book clubs before, I can bring up the people's questions on the screen, but
I can see some questions.
Yeah, so we can see them. Normally I can bring them up at the same time, so it will say their name, but so I'll read it out instead. Rihanna has asked us, how long does it take you to research the book before it's published? I think that is a great question.
It's kind of how long is a piece of string, I suppose. I think I'm always researching right up to final. So to give a sort of time frame, so I found out the true story that inspired The Bird in the Bamboo Cage in 2017, and I finished final edits for the book in March of this year. And up to that point, I was still fact checking, the tiny details of, distances traveled, how long would it have taken such a thing to happen? Did my ages work out if someone was born here, there? So those tiny details, they keep you awake at night, don't they, Laura, even after your final pages have gone in. So that was a long one for me, was, 3 years really, but it needed to, because it was a space I hadn't researched or written in before.
So for me, this is a very tricky question to answer, because I feel like a lot of the research is, like you say, on the one hand, it's ongoing, and then sometimes though I bring in things that I maybe researched a very long time ago. So, maybe they sort of percolate there, for the research percolates for a long time, and then it appears in a story, So I'll give you an example. I mean, the night portrait was actually a very fast research time frame for me. It was 2 years, but like you said, I was checking things up until the day I turned in my manuscript to my editor. But I had another book out earlier this year called The Giant, which is a novel of Michelangelo's David. And that book actually began as a nonfiction project for me over 20 years ago. And so I had done a ton of research about Michelangelo and the creation of the David. And I just had, reams of notes and things, and a sort of a basic nonfiction manuscript. And then I had decided to put that project away for a while. And one day it occurred to me that actually this is supposed to be a novel and not a nonfiction story. So when I transformed it into a novel, then again, I was back in the research that I had already done. And then new things, scholars are learning all the time. New things have been discovered about the David in the meantime. And there was lots of new scholarship in the last 5-10 years about it. So again, I was researching and fact checking up until the day I, published the book. Yeah. So it's that was more than 20 years worth of research. So it really, my book, The Gondola Maker, began again as a nonfiction project. A lot of that research went into my nonfiction guidebook made in Italy, and then through the course of interviewing the living gondola makers in Venice, this story of this gondola maker and his complicated relationship with his father popped into my head. So the nonfiction research then fueled this novel. So for me, it's very non-linear, I guess. There are things that sort of go dormant for a while and then come back to life in some other form. So who knows?
And I think, often I talk to writers who are thinking about writing historical fiction, and they're very intimidated by not knowing things. And I always say, don't be afraid of what you don't yet know, because it's amazing how much you can discover. And, don't be afraid to contact somebody at a museum or an expert in X, Y, or Z. Don't be afraid of feeling like, I can't because I'm not a proper writer. I think people, if they're passionate about a subject, they love being asked about it. They love telling you their expertise. And obviously we move in and out of areas of expertise to a degree, choosing different subjects in our historical novels. Whereas if you are a historian of World War II history in China, for example, that's your expertise. So, I'd always encourage people, don't be afraid of embarking on a period of historical research, if that's something you're interested in writing. And obviously, if you're interested in reading, we're there.
Yeah, and like you say, really the research often is highly, highly specific. Like if your character is eating a carrot in 16th century Venice, well, what kind of carrots did they have in 16th century Venice? There's your research question for the day,
And did they have pineapples in London in 1875?
Holes like that, right?
I remember researching and this is how weird research gets in writing The Girl from the Savoy. I ended up going down an enormous rabbit hole of research about heating systems in hotels in the 1920s, because I was, did they have a fire in their room? Was there central heating? How did the elevators work? And what was on the floors of the hotel for the servants? And it's tiny detail that, as we've said already, a reader should never be bothered about, but we need to get it right. We do need to get it right.
This morning I was on eBay researching typewriters manufactured in France in the 1930s.
And that's a whole morning. That's a whole morning.
But I guess that the sort of stuff as well, when you start writing, you're like writing it, and then you get to a stage and you're like, oh, but what did, what beverage would they have at this point?
Absolutely, yeah. And how things are so different now, and you do have to sort of pause and get out of your 21st century head and think about etiquette, through history has been so important. What you can and can't do, say, how things are served. There were so many more manners, I think, and rules around social interaction. And you've really got to understand that. And then, culturally, so with the bird in the bamboo cage, I had to understand Chinese culture. I had to understand how the British, what was their view of Chinese culture in the 1940s, and how do I write that's acceptable to a very contemporary audience, where obviously we're very sensitive about how we speak about other cultures, how we represent other cultures. I had to talk about obviously how the Japanese soldiers treated the people that they were, that they were their captors. And, it's difficult to get out of your own way sometimes and think, but that's horrible. He couldn't possibly have done that. Well, he did.
Yeah.
And that's how people thought and spoke. And you've got to be authentic. I think you've really got to be honest to the period of history that you're writing about.
Yeah, absolutely.
Good point. Yeah, what a fantastic answer from you both. Thank you. We're getting some lovely comments here as well, which again, I'm so sad that I can't bring them up onto the screen, so I'm gonna have to read them out. But Mickey's saying hello from Gloucester, and she says, I love that you guys care so much about the little details. It's lovely to do. It's amazing.
3 o'clock in the morning, we're wide awake worrying about bananas.
And then what else? Colin saying hi from Portsmouth. Hello. And Sue's joined us from Ontario, Canada. Amazing.
Hi, Sue.
You. And hi to everyone else. So we've got another question here from Julie that says, hi ladies, if you could be stuck in a lift/elevator with anyone from history, who would you choose and why? That's a good question. That's a tough question.
Well,
how big is the elevator?
In the midst of, what's that, Hazel?
I said, how big's the elevator?
A lot of people. God, not hard questions. Choose just one.
I'm in the midst of researching the Mona Lisa right now, and I have so many questions for her.
Yeah,
so many. It would take a lot more time than an elevator ride, I think, to get all my questions answered.
It's an amazing question. And I think, we're so lucky that we do sort of temporarily inhabit people's lives. And, I've written about survivors of the Titanic. I've written about flower sellers in Victorian London. I've written about Grace Kelly. Grace Darling, who was a famous lighthouse keeper. I'd love to actually meet her. I think Grace Darling, of all the real historical characters I've written about, I have a real affinity with her. She's a girl from the northeast of England, like myself. I really would love to sit down with her and say, what was it really like when you were thrust into fame at the age of 22, and, how her life living on a remote lighthouse suddenly changed overnight, and how did you feel about that? She seemed like a very tender character to me, and I'd love to sit and have tea with her in an elevator.
In an elevator, yeah. Absolutely. I love that. So I've got another question for you both here, which we've kind of touched on a little bit, but I'd like to expand on. So obviously you've both written other incredible historical fiction novels, but what is it about the historical fiction genre that so draws you in to want to write in this genre? I mean, we've already talked about many, many reasons, but I'd like to hear in more detail. Laura, would you like to go first?
Sure. Well, as I mentioned, I started my career as an academic, and felt and still feel very passionate about art history. I think it's the most fascinating subject in the entire world. And, I started out thinking that I was going to spend the rest of my career as a college professor, and I, learned how to write in this very specific kind of dry academic way. And I have the utmost respect for people who do write academically, because it is a learned skill, and it requires a ton of dedication and expertise and research. But, when I was 4 or 5 years old and someone asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up, I always said I wanted to be a writer. And so somewhere along that journey of academic writing, I felt like I was going to burst. And so, I just felt like, oh gosh, this is, we've somehow made the most interesting subject in the world very dry and inaccessible. And so for me, the joy of reading historical fiction versus history is that you really do walk in the footsteps of people who lived in the past. You eat their food, you see what they see, you smell what they smell. And so it's a way to experience the past without getting whacked over the head with a textbook. It's a way to really immerse yourself and really feel what it was like to live in the past. And I always love it when I come across a great historical novel that's set in some place that I've never been or don't know that much about. I mean, that's why I love Your Bird in the Bamboo Cage, because I'm just dying to explore that part of China that I've never been to. I love reading books set in far-flung locations or about people that are fascinating. So it's just, I think, a way to really live in someone else's body for a little while from the past.
I totally agree. And I think it's that combination of, I love reading historical fiction because it's the best of both worlds. It's a cracking story, but it's based in fact. And I think that combination of when you turn the last page and you want to go and Google or read another book about that real thing, that to me is the ultimate, because I think history has the most incredible events and people, and they have all informed who we are and the world we live in. We've come from there. So I think there's this inherent kind of voyeurism of what would I have done? And those people really experienced that. My goodness, that was so harrowing or so amazing and brave. And I think there is that human connection going right back to the start, that even though these things happened, whether it's 500 years ago or 50 years ago, there's that human fascination of what would I have done? How would I have coped? And I think that's what we do as historical novelists, is portray that through the characters that we write. And I think it's endlessly, history, you literally could not make it up. And I think that's why it's such an amazing resource to go to for inspiration as a writer. And as Laura said, if you're interested in the past, but you don't want that dry delivery, we can add color and texture to that historical landscape. And, you can see in how many movies at the moment are being adapted from historical novels from history. There's something about the times we're living in now, and I think we look to the past to take comfort from things being difficult before, and to be reassured we can get around that again. And it's, I think it's very telling at the moment that we are turning to the past when our own lives are very, very difficult. So, long may the love of historical fiction period drama last, because there's so many stories to be told.
So many to be told. And that's it as well. You both sort of touched on it, but that sort of being able to connect with people from the past as well. We do care so much about that, and that's, both as historical fiction novelists can, by making it into a imaginative story full of life and character, that's what you bring to us as readers, which is just so special. So thank you, basically. But we've got actually a great question here, which also does lead me on to the next question I was going to ask. So I think that's perfect. Michelle has asked us, she says, hello from Florida, firstly. Hello to Florida. She says, adored both of your books. Each required lots of post-reading Googling. What time periods will your next books be in? And so my next question for you both were, what are you working on now? And so then also to answer Michelle, what time periods will your next books be in? Laura, would you like to go first?
Yeah, thank you for asking. I'm racing toward a deadline right now on another dual timeline historical novel that goes back and forth between the Italian Renaissance and World War II. So it's another similar type of juxtaposition to the Night Portrait. And this is a little bit of a spoiler alert, I guess, that Leonardo da Vinci makes another appearance. So,
Love
That's
the
I don't have
amazing.
titles yet.
Yeah.
I'm mulling over a lot of titles at the moment.
Exciting. And when do you think that might be out, or is there any sort of
In 2021.
2021?
Yeah.
We'll keep an eye out. What about you, Hazel?
Well, this is where I confess that I'm so far behind in my writing this year. I'm in the early stages of my next solo book, shall we say, and I'm looking into the Second World War, but again, an event, a part of that we haven't heard about before. And I found the story not too long ago, and I'm doing that initial sort of percolation of ideas, and I'm already hooked, and I can't wait to understand it more so I can write about it. So that will hopefully be possibly 2022 release, because next year in 2021 I have my next. Every now and again I co-write a book with an amazing author in the States, Heather Webb. So we wrote Last Christmas in Paris together, Meet Me in Monaco, which came out last year, which was about the wedding of Grace Kelly. And our next double act, if you like, is due for release in the summer of 2021, called 3 Words for Goodbye, and it's set in the pre-World War II years, and it was loosely inspired by an amazing woman called Nellie Bly, who was an investigative journalist in America and famously traveled around the world in less than 80 days, beating Jules Verne's fictional record of 80 days. Yeah. And we've used that as an inspiration for 2 feuding sisters who go off around Europe to wrap up some loose ends on behalf of their grandmother. So you'll hear more about that in the coming months.
Sounds great. Both of these, I'm so excited for both of these new books. Can't wait. Amazing. So yeah, Nikki has actually commented here saying it's our way to time travel too, which is
it is.
Yeah, I've had a lot of readers tell me that was the thing that they enjoyed the most in reading my latest book, was the opportunity to be in Italy and Germany now when they can't actually go there. So I think that is another thing that historical fiction does well, is it allows people to travel vicariously.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it, to pick up a book? And I think we've all turned to books for distraction from endlessly scrolling through Twitter and looking at the news. And I think historical fiction can really grip you because it takes you to not just a different setting, but a different time. And I think it really has that capacity to hook a reader and get you invested and totally distract you from reality, because it looks very different when you open the book.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that kind of answered my my next question that I had, which is, why do we love historical fiction so much? I didn't know about it, but it's
because it's the best.
It's just the best, isn't it? I think we can all say that. We can all agree. So I'm now on to my final question, but gosh, we could just keep chatting about this forever, but I've just realized it's been like 50 minutes, but I'm just like, we'll just keep chatting. Lovely. But my final question now for you both is one that I always end our book clubs on, which is, what would you say about the books when pressing them into someone else's hands? Which can be perhaps a bit tricky, I've been told, this question. But Laura, would you like to go first?
Yeah, well, boy, I'm not sure this is a great answer to this question, but one of the questions that kept popping up for me in researching the Night Portrait, and specifically the mission of the Monuments Men, is, what is the value in a war or in a crisis? What is the value of a work of art versus a human life? And this is something that Dominic, one of the protagonists, struggles a lot with in the story. And I think the answer is that the arts make our life worth living. And I think that it's fascinating now we're in a time when the arts are making our lives worth living right now. Look at all of the Netflix and the Amazon Prime and the TV shows and the movies and the books that we're turning to right now, and the virtual Zooms and the online exhibitions and things that we are turning to in this time of crisis, which Hazel alluded to. And so really, I think that time traveling with a book is always a great idea, but perhaps now more than ever before, it's really playing an important role in our culture.
Absolutely. That's a brilliant answer. What about you, Hazel?
Well, which one? Because I've got two versions of the same book. So for everyone in Canada and the States, it's called When We Were Young and Brave. And everyone else, it's The Bird in the Bamboo Cage. So I would press the right version into your hands. And I would say, I think what I'd say is if you haven't read historical fiction before, or if you haven't read World War II fiction, this is a different part of that event. It's a part of the World War II experience we haven't read about or spoken about as much. And I would encourage people to give it a try and to step into that world of a young girl lost without her parents and her teacher, whose job now is to not only protect them from war, but to protect them from growing up. And how we all have that incredible teacher in our lives who became more than a teacher. I would ask them to remember that person when they're reading the book. And I would ask them to let me know when they get to the bit that will make them cry.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, amazing. I think that's exactly right. What you both said. They're just two absolutely incredible stories, but also about, as I said earlier, like an area that we think we know quite well, but then you've both, uncovered these two different incredible stories that we just don't, I didn't know much about at all. And I think that is just the power of historical fiction, to be able to transport us to another time and other people's experiences and learn from them, but also take comfort in the fact that, as you both touched on, that we're in a difficult time right now, but there's been a lot of difficult times throughout history, and we can learn from these people from that. Yeah, that's my little summary.
That was a lovely summary.
Thank you so much to you both for joining me today. And Nikki's just added here the power of books are magical, and I think that's a lovely sentence to end on.
And I think, I hope that people can turn to books. We're living through curious times, and do what you need to do to get through it. And if we can help in a little way, then I think books can be very magical in that way. So just thank you to everyone for joining us, and stay safe. And thank you for reading our books. And thank you to Laura for being so lovely.
Thank you, Mel and Hazel, and thank you everyone who's joined us too. I really appreciate it, and happy reading to everyone.
Yes, amazing. Thank you so much to you both for joining us today, and thank you to all of you out there as well. And I'm sorry about the technical difficulties, but
we got there.
We'll be resharing this everywhere, so we can make sure that anyone that missed it, they can catch up. But yeah, thank you so much to you both. It was such a fascinating conversation, and I enjoyed it so much. Thank you. Thank you. I'll just disappear you both away, and then I'll just tell the rest of the people about what we've got coming up next week. But thank you so much.
Thank you
guys.
Bye, Hazel.
Bye, Laura. See you soon.
Bye. Amazing. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm very sorry again about our technical difficulties. Had a couple of these in a row, but I'm going to get to the bottom of it. But thank you. Yeah, just thank you for joining us. And thank you so much again to Laura and Hazel. It was just a fascinating conversation. And I can't believe it's almost been an hour of us chatting. Could have just kept going. So yeah, thank you very much. But before I go, I just want to quickly tell you about another very exciting book club that we have coming up next week with Georgia Toffolo, also known as the Queen of the Jungle, for any I'm a Celebrity fans out there. Georgia's debut novel, Meet Me in London, is out tomorrow, and it's an absolutely brilliant classic romance. So next Wednesday at 3 p.m. UK time, I'll be catching up with Georgia and hearing all about her fantastic new book. So you definitely won't want to miss that. So add it to your diaries right now. But for now, I hope you have a lovely, lovely rest of your day wherever you are in the world. And thank you so much for joining again, and I'll see you next week.